The wind rolled across the open street of Dry Creek, carrying with it a fine haze of red dust that clung to everything it touched: windows, signs, boots, and skin. It was the kind of day where the sun pressed down like an anvil, making the air shimmer above the hard-packed road. Folks in town stayed under awnings or behind doors, waiting for the stagecoach to come rattling through on its noonday run. Down by the stage stop, a woman stood alone. She was young mid-20s, maybe, but the long miles she'd traveled had left faint shadows under her eyes. Clara Whitmore clutched a worn leather satchel against her side, one hand fidgeting with the brass clasp as if keeping it closed might hold her together, too. Inside were not coins or trinkets, but bandages, a small bottle of quinine, and the last of her clean gauze. She had been on the road for nearly a week, starting from Fort Laramie, passing through ranch country, and finally here to Dry Creek. Her destination lay still farther, a rough little mining camp high in the hills called Red Hollow, where a fever was said to be spreading faster than the men could dig. She had volunteered when others hesitated. Somebody's got to go, she'd told herself. If not me, then who? But now, standing in the noon glare, she felt her knees weakening. The heat was like a physical weight pressing her down. Her dress, dusty blue cotton, was streaked brown from the road. Her bonnet hung loose around her neck, and the tendrils of hair plastered to her cheeks spoke of hours spent under an unforgiving sun. Her stomach clenched with hunger. She hadn't had more than a heel of bread since yesterday morning. The last sip from her canteen had been hours ago, and the stage was late. From somewhere behind, she heard the creak of leather and the faint jingle of spurs. A figure stood in the shade of the general store's porch, just far enough into the shadows that the light didn't catch his face. He leaned against a post, a long duster coat hanging loose over his shoulders. The brim of his hat pulled low. Clara barely noticed him. She had fixed her eyes down the road, watching the wavering horizon for the stagecoach's outline. Her vision blurred once, then again. She blinked hard, trying to force the world back into focus. Her satchel slipped from her fingers and thudded. Softly against the dirt, the stagecoach finally appeared, a dark, swaying shape, 4 horses pounding up dust in a long trailing cloud. Relief stirred in her chest, but it was short-lived. A strange ringing filled her ears. The ground seemed to shift under her feet. She took one step forward and the world tilted sharply to the left. A sound escaped her lips, half gasp, half protest, before her legs gave way entirely. She pitched forward. The dusty street rushed up to meet her, but she never struck the ground. Arms caught her, strong, steady, smelling faintly of gun oil and leather. Her head lolled sideways against a chest, hearing a heartbeat under layers of cloth. "Easy there, darlin'," a deep voice drawled, close to her ear. "You're not going down on my watch." She blinked up into the shadow of a man's face, hat brimmed still low, but she caught the glint of pale eyes watching her, sharp and assessing. Her mouth was dry, the words barely a whisper. "Who?" The man's lips pressed into a line. "Without." Answering, he shifted her weight easily into his arms, one under her knees, the other cradling her back. He turned away from the street, his boots silent despite the spurs, and started walking toward the far end of town. The last thing Clara saw before darkness took her was the sun flashing on the polished metal of his revolver. The last thing she heard was his voice, low and certain. "You're coming with me." The first thing Clara became aware of was the smell, faint but unmistakable gun oil mixed with something sharp, like tobacco that had burned down to its last ember. The air was cooler here than outside, and there was no grit of blowing dust against her skin. She was lying on something soft, though the pillow was thin and the blanket scratchy against her cheek. She kept her eyes closed for a moment, letting the steady tick of a clock fill the silence. Somewhere outside, she could hear the faint creak of a sign swinging in the wind, the muffled clop of hooves on dirt, Then a chair scraped lightly across wooden floorboards. "You awake?" The voice made her eyes open. He was sitting there, the man in a plain wooden chair angled just enough to keep him between her and the door. His hat was pushed back now, revealing dark hair with a streak of silver at the temple. His face was lean, weathered from sun and wind, with a jaw that looked like it had been clenched through more than one gunfight, and his eyes light gray, almost silver, were locked on her with a quiet intensity that made her skin prickle. She struggled to push herself up, but a wave of weakness rolled through her and she sank back against the thin pillow. "You were out cold," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Heat'll do that if you're running on empty." She swallowed, the dryness in her throat making her voice rasp. "Where am I?" "My place. Back of the livery." He reached for something on the table beside him and poured water from a tin pitcher into a battered cup. "Here." She hesitated, but the sight of the water-cool, droplets clinging to the rim was too much. She reached for it, but her hand trembled. Without a word, he steadied the cup for her until she'd taken several long, greedy swallows. The relief was immediate. She set the cup down and wiped her lips with the back of her hand. I was waiting for the stage." "I know," he cut in. "Would have made it if you hadn't been ready to drop." Her eyes narrowed. "You carried me away from the—" "Stop. Why?" The coach was coming. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the leather of his coat creaking softly. His gaze didn't waver. "Couldn't let you get on that coach." Her brow furrowed. "You couldn't let me?" "That's right." His tone was flat, but there was something underneath, something she couldn't read yet. "Too many eyes on you. Too many hands itching for a chance to grab you for you make it to where you're going." She stared at him, a sharp unease prickling through her exhaustion. "Who are you?" A faint smile tugged at one corner of his mouth, though it held no warmth. "Name's Kane Mercer." The name meant nothing to her, but it felt heavy, like it had been carried a long way and through the kind of trouble people didn't talk about. In daylight, "Well, Kane Mercer," she said, trying to muster some edge in her voice, "I didn't ask to be brought here. I have work to do, people to help. You need to take me back." "No." The single word landed between them like the click of a cocked revolver. Her pulse jumped. "No, you can't just—" "Yes, I can," he said quietly, leaning forward. Now, his elbows resting on his knees. "And you'll thank me for it later." She glared at him, trying to read his expression, but those pale eyes gave nothing away. He didn't look like a kidnapper. He didn't even look angry. He looked like a man who'd already decided the outcome and was just waiting for her to see the sense in it. "You're not making any sense," she said finally. "Why would anyone want to stop me from getting to Red Hollow?" He studied her for a long moment, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Her breath caught when his hand came out holding a folded slip of paper. He tossed it onto the small table beside the pitcher. It slid toward her. She glanced at it, then back at him. Slowly, she reached for it, unfolded it, and froze. It was a handbill. Her name was printed in bold black letters. Under it, "Wanted, $200. No crime listed." Just a sketch of her face, accurate enough to make her stomach turn. Her fingers went cold. "What is this?" "That," Kane said, "is why you're not on that coach." For a long moment, Clara simply stared at the handbill, her mind refusing to believe the thick black ink was real. The paper felt rough under her fingertips, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. The words "wanted," $200 seemed to loom larger with every heartbeat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. This has to be a mistake." Kane Mercer didn't answer right away. He sat still in his chair, watching her reaction like a man measuring the speed of a storm on the horizon. His pale eyes never left her face. A mistake, she repeated, louder this time, forcing herself to look up at him. I'm a nurse. I heal people. I've never broken the law in my life. That, Kane said finally, is probably why. You're worth more dead than alive, her breath caught. What? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The boards under his boots creaked faintly as he shifted his weight. I was in the telegraph office an hour before you. Came through town. Saw one of these handbills come in. Men in Red Hollow sent it out fast. No reason listed, no crime named. Just your face, your name, and $200 for anyone who makes sure you never get there. That's absurd. She snapped. Why would anyone? There. Afraid of you, he interrupted. She blinked. Afraid? Of me? You're going up there to treat fever, right? Yes, he nodded slowly. And that fever's not from bad water or bad air. It's from the well they've been poisoning. Couple of men up there want the land cleared. Easier to buy claims from dead miners' families than from miners who are still breathing. The words sank into her like ice water, but still she shook her head. That can't be true, Kane's mouth hardened. You think I'm making this up? I've seen it before. Seen men pour lye in a creek upstream of a camp. Seen 'em spread disease just to drive folks out. And the ones in Red Hollow, well, they're smart enough to know that if you get there, you'll figure out what's really killing people. She gripped the handbill tighter, anger starting to cut through her shock. So their solution is to have me killed? That's right. Her voice rose. And you expect me to just sit here, hide, and let them keep poisoning people? Kane's gaze was steady, unflinching. I expect you to stay alive long enough to do something about it. Before she could respond, the sharp crack of glass shattered the tense silence. The window to her right exploded inward, shards scattering across the floor. Something hot and fast hissed past her ear and buried itself in the wall. A bullet. Kane moved faster than she could think. One moment he was in the chair, the next he was on his feet, revolver in hand, crouched low near the window frame. Down, he barked. Clara dropped to the floor, heart hammering, the taste of dust and fear sharp in her mouth. Another shot tore through the doorway, splintering the frame. Kane returned, fired 2 quick, precise shots that made her flinch. The sound in the small room was deafening. Then, silence. Kane stayed still for a long moment, listening. His revolver never wavered from the open space beyond the window. Finally, he eased back, though his jaw was tight. They found you quicker than I thought, he muttered. We need to move. Now. Clara's voice shook. You mean, they'll come through that door next, and I'm not in the mood to count how many. He grabbed her satchel from where it leaned against the wall and shoved it into her hands. Then he was pulling her toward the back of the building, his grip firm but not rough. They slipped out into a narrow alley behind the livery where the pimpin to a narrow alley behind the livery where narrow alley behind the livery where the pin. Shadows were deeper and the smell of horses hung heavy in the air. Somewhere out on the street, a man's voice called to another, too far away for Clara to catch the words. Kane's pace quickened. She stumbled after him, still clutching the handbill. Why are you helping me? Kane didn't slow. Let's just say I've got a score to settle with the kind of men who sent for you. And when we get to Red Hollow? She pressed. He glanced back at her, and for the first time there was something almost human in his expression, something that wasn't cold steel. When we get there, he said, we make him regret ever printing your name. The alley behind the livery opened into a stretch of hard-packed dirt littered with stray hay and old wagon ruts. A few sleepy mules shifted in their pens, flicking their ears at flies, oblivious to the fact that somewhere out front men were loading rifles with Clara's name attached to the bullets. Kane kept a firm hold on her wrist. his boots moving with the soundless precision of someone who had spent too many years slipping in and out of danger. Clara's heart pounded so hard she thought the men on the street might hear it. They reached the far end of the livery, where two horses stood saddled and waiting, a tall black gelding with a scar across its muzzle, and a smaller bay mare with a white blaze. "Up," Kane ordered, jerking his chin toward the mare. Clara hesitated. You had these ready?" "Always keep an exit," he muttered, scanning the rooftops before swinging up onto the black gelding in one smooth motion. Clara scrambled into the saddle, awkward from exhaustion and nerves. The leather creaked under her weight. Before she could ask where they were going, Kane wheeled the gelding toward the open country and kicked it into a gallop. The mare lunged after him, hooves pounding, the wind tearing at Clara's bonnet. The narrow streets of Dry Creek blurred past empty porches, shuttered windows, the occasional startled shout from someone who saw them streak by. Then they were out on the open plain. The land stretched in all directions, rolling grass browned by the sun, scattered mesquite, and far-off hills that shimmered in the heat. Kane didn't slow until the town was just a dust haze behind them. Only then did he glance over his shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon. "They'll follow," he sighed. "But we've got a head start." Clara gripped the reins tighter. "For how long?" "That depends how good you are at staying in the saddle." They rode hard for hours, taking no road she recognized, sometimes cutting across Dry Creek beds, sometimes weaving through stands of cottonwood where the leaves whispered overhead. The sun sank lower, throwing long shadows across the land, but Kane didn't stop Dot when they finally slowed to a walk. Clara's legs ached from gripping the horse. Her lips were cracked, her hands sore. She was about to speak when Kane held up a hand for silence. He was listening. She held her breath, straining to hear. At first, nothing. Then a faint, distant thud. "Hoofbeats. They're closer than I thought," Kane murmured. He scanned the ridges to the west. "We're changing direction." Without waiting for her reply, he turned sharply toward a rocky rise and urged his gelding into a climb. Clara followed, the mare's hooves scraping against stone. The path narrowed, hemmed in by jagged rock walls. When they reached the top, Kane dismounted and motioned for her to do the same. "From here," he said, tying the gelding's reins to a scrub pine, "we move quiet." Clara slid down, her knees trembling. "Quiet?" "They're riding after us with guns, and they'll ride right past if we keep to the rocks," he said, leading her along a narrow ledge. Tracks disappear on stone. They followed the ledge until it opened into a shallow cave. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling faintly of damp earth. Kane set down his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle dried meat, a flask, and a rolled blanket. "Eat," he said simply, tossing her a strip of jerky. She chewed slowly, her jaw aching, the salty tang waking up her hunger. Kane sat near the entrance, his revolver resting across his knees. Eyes fixed on the valley below Dot as the light faded, she risked asking, "How long have you done this?" He didn't look at her. "Long enough to know the difference between a fair fight and a stacked deck." She waited, but he said no more. Later, when the stars came out and the coyotes sang in the distance, Kane moved to where she sat wrapped in the blanket. "You ever shoot?" he asked out, her brow furrowed. "A gun? No." "You will by the time we get to Red Hollow." She stared at him. "I'm a nurse. I heal." "I don't. You live through this," he interrupted, "and you'll be glad you know how to defend yourself." There was no bravado in his voice, no hint of trying to impress her. Just a quiet certainty that made her skin prickle. She didn't answer, but when he handed her his revolver, she didn't refuse. The morning they reached the outskirts of Red Hollow, the sky was a pale wash of silver, the air sharp with the scent of pine and coal smoke. The town clung to the slope of a hill, its wooden buildings weathered and crooked, with a single street. running like a scar through the center. Above it, the dark mouths of mine shafts gaped in the hillsides. From their vantage point, Clara could see the sickness in the place, not in the buildings, but in the people. Even at this distance, the few figures moving in the street walked hunched, thin, their faces drawn. No children played, no laughter carried on the air. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, too steady to belong to a town at ease. Kane studied it all with those pale eyes of his, the brim of his hat casting a hard shadow over his face. "They'll know we're here the moment we ride in," he said. Clara gripped the reins of her mare. "Then let's not waste time. They need help." He turned his gaze on her, measuring. "You sure you're ready to walk into a room where every man in it might want you dead?" She met his stare. "I'm more afraid of letting people die, when I could have saved them." A flicker of something respect maybe passed through his expression. Then he gave a short nod. "All right, we do it together." They rode down into the main street at a steady walk, drawing eyes from doorways and windows. Clara felt the weight of those stares, curiosity, suspicion, and something colder. By the time they stopped in front of the Silver Ace Saloon, a handful of men had stepped out onto the boardwalk, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. Kane swung down from his gelding and tied the reins to the hitching post. He didn't bother checking to see if Clara followed. He knew she would. The saloon doors swung inward at his push, letting out the scent of whiskey. Tobacco and unwashed bodies dot inside. The air was dim, lit by oil lamps and the weak morning light through grimy windows. A piano stood silent in the corner. At a long table near the back, 5 men sat playing cards. One of them, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a scar running from ear to jaw, looked up, saw Kane, and stilled. "Well," the man drawled, setting down his cards, "if it ain't Kane Mercer. Didn't figure you for charity work." Kane stepped forward, his coat shifting just enough to show the revolver at his side. "I'm here for the one who put out that bounty on the lady." The bearded man's gaze slid to Clara, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "That's her, all right. Pretty thing. Shame." Clara felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her chin high. "You poisoned the well." The man laughed, a deep, mean sound. "I did what needed doing. Miners get sick, they leave. Land gets cheap. Business, missy. You wouldn't understand." "I understand enough," she said, her voice steady, "to know you've killed people for money." Kane's hand hovered near his gun. "Last chance, Rourke. Call off the bounty. Let her do her work." Rourke leaned back in his chair. "Or what?" The answer came in the sharp, echoing click of Kane's revolver hammer. The room went still. The men at the other tables froze, hands half lifted from their drinks. "Or you'll be buried before." "The next hand's dealt," Kane said quietly. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of Rourke's men went for his gun. The saloon exploded into chaos. Kane's revolver barked twice, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. Clara ducked behind a table as splinters flew. Rourke's men scattered, overturning chairs, the smell of gunpowder thickening the air. A man lunged toward Kane with a knife, but Kane caught him by the wrist, twisted hard, and drove the butt of his gun into the man's jaw. He went down like a sack of grain. Clara crawled to the corner, pulling her satchel open with shaking hands. A wounded miner hit and the crossfire slumped against the wall, clutching his side. Blood seeped between his fingers. "Hold still," she told him, her voice sharp with focus. She tore open a packet of gauze, pressing it to the wound. Around her, the gunfight roared on, boots thudding, glasses shattering. Men shouting. Then silence. She looked up to see Kane standing over Rourke, his revolver still aimed. The bearded man was on his knees, one hand raised, the other clutching his shoulder where a dark stain spread. "It's over," Kane said, his voice low but carrying. Rourke spat on the floor. "You think you've won? You can't change this town." Kane's eyes went colder than ice. "No, but she can." He holstered his gun and stepped back, letting the law, such as it was, take Rourke into custody. Clara rose from her patient, her hands red with someone else's blood, but her eyes burning with determination. Red Hollow felt different in the days after Rourke was taken away. It wasn't loud or celebratory. Folks here were too tired for that. But there was a shift, like a wind changing direction. Men who'd been too sick to stand were slowly making it back to the mines, their cheeks gaining color. Women who'd been keeping children inside for fear of fever let them run in the street again. Their laughter brittle but real. Clara Whitmore was at the center of it all. The small, bare bones clinic she set up in the abandoned boarding house became a constant hum of activity. She moved from cot to cot with her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back, dosing quinine, changing bandages, checking pulses. At night, when the oil lamp burned low, she would write lists of the medicines they'd need before winter came. Then get up before sunrise to start all over again. And Kane. Mercer was always somewhere close. He didn't linger inside the clinic too restless, too aware of how out of place a man with his past looked among the sick and the children, but she would catch sight of him on the boardwalk, leaning against a post, scanning the street. Sometimes he was gone for hours, only to return with sacks of flour from the next town, or a crate of bottled water from the spring he'd found, upriver. They didn't talk about what came next. Until the morning he came to her door. She was packing away her satchel when she felt the shadow in the doorway. Looking up, she saw him there, hat in hand, dust on his coat, his pale eyes steady. "Town safe now," he said simply. "My work here's done." Her hand stilled on the satchel strap. "And mine's not, I know." He stepped inside, just far enough that she could see the faint bruise on his jaw from the saloon fight. "You've got people who need you. I'm just not one of them." She tried to smile, but it felt thin. "You're leaving then?" He nodded once. "Heading south." "There's another camp, same kind of trouble." Clara swallowed hard. She'd known this was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. Kane. She hesitated, unsure if she wanted to thank him or tell him to stay. He looked away first, toward the street. "That day at the stage stop, I wasn't planning on getting involved. Just passing through. But you," he shook his head, "you reminded me there's still people worth fighting for." Her throat tightened. "Then why not stay?" A faint smile touched his mouth. "Because the kind of trouble I carry, it doesn't belong in one place too long." There was no arguing with that. She knew it as well as he did. So she walked with him to the edge of town. The sun was just cresting the ridge, painting the hills in gold. His black gelding stood waiting, stamping at the dirt. Kane swung into the saddle, settling like a man who'd been born to it. He looked down at her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, just as he turned his horse to leave, he stopped. His gaze caught hers, and something passed between them, something unspoken, but as solid as the ground under their boots. "You're coming with me," he said, the words softer than they'd been the first time, stripped of command and filled instead with invitation. Clara's breath caught. She glanced back toward the clinic, then at him, and she smiled.